The dust hung thick in the air as Violet Hayes stood frozen at the entrance of Miller's General Store, her heart pounding in her chest like a wild Mustang. It wasn't the 6-hour stagecoach journey from Boston that had her petrified, nor the scorching New Mexico Territory sun of 1878. It was the roomful of strangers whose curious eyes now locked on her like hunters spotting a rare deer. "Are you coming in or just planning to let all the heat inside, miss?" called the shopkeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. Violet clutched her small valise tighter and forced her feet to move. Each step felt like she was wading through molasses as she made her way to the counter, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched. The floorboards creaked beneath her polished boots that were far too impractical for this rugged landscape, but had seemed appropriate in her Boston dressmaker's shop. I'm looking for directions to the Hayes Ranch," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper leaned forward. "You'll have to speak up, miss. Can't hear a mouse in a windstorm." A deep voice from the corner of the store answered instead. "Hayes Place is about 5 miles north. Following the creek will get you there." Violet turned to see a tall man leaning against a barrel of flour. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast from his wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in a few days' stubble. His clothes were worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing tanned, muscular forearms, and a leather vest that had seen better days. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, dropping her gaze again. "You planning on walking there?" he asked, pushing himself upright. He stood at least a foot taller than her 5 feet 4 inches. Violet's cheeks flushed. She hadn't thought that far ahead. The telegram from her uncle had simply instructed her to come to Cottonwood Springs after her parents' passing, but provided no details on transportation from town. I hadn't. The man sighed. "I'm headed that direction. I can take you," the shopkeeper chuckled. "Best offer you'll get today, miss. That's Preston Vance, foreman at the Circle R, honest as the day is long, though he don't talk much more than you seem to." Preston tipped his hat slightly. "Wagon's outside. I'll be leaving in 10 minutes with or without you." Without waiting for her response, he gathered his purchases, paid, and strode out the door. Violet found herself rushing to gather the few supplies she thought she might need: some hard candies, a small notebook, and a pencil. As she paid, the shopkeeper leaned in. "Don't you worry about Vance. Rough around the edges, but there ain't a better man in the territory. Your uncle's place is about 3 miles from Circle R. They're neighbors, such as it is out here where neighbors can be miles apart." Violet nodded her thanks and hurried outside. The wagon was simple but sturdy, loaded with supplies and hitched to 2 strong horses. Preston Vance was securing a barrel in the back and didn't look up when she approached. "I'm ready, Mr. Vance," she said, attempting to sound more confident than she felt. He glanced at her, his eyes the color of a summer sky, and nodded toward the wagon. "Up you go, then." Violet stared at the high seat, wondering how she was supposed to climb up in her modest but still restrictive skirt. Preston watched her for a moment before extending his hand. "You Boston folk ever ride in wagons?" Violet felt her face flush again. "Not frequently, no." His large hand engulfed hers as he helped her up, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through her arm. Once seated, she smoothed her skirt and placed her valise carefully at her feet. Preston climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. The wagon lurched forward, and Violet grabbed the edge of the seat to steady herself. The town of Cottonwood Springs, if it could be called a town with its single street of buildings, quickly gave way to open country. The landscape was unlike anything Violet had seen before: vast, wild, with mountains in the distance and stretches of scrubland dotted with cacti and twisted juniper trees. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the steady clip-clop of hooves, and the occasional call of a bird overhead. Violet stole glances at her traveling companion, noting the strong profile and the way he handled the reins with easy confidence. "Your uncle know you're coming?" Preston finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, I sent a telegram before I left Boston." He adjusted his hat against the sun. "Hayes mentioned a niece, didn't say when. My parents passed last month, influenza." The words still caught in her throat, the grief still raw. Preston's eyes softened slightly. "Sorry to hear it. Thank you." Violet looked down at her gloved hands. "Uncle Thomas is my only remaining family. He's a good man, stubborn as they come, but good." The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Preston's arm shot out instinctively to steady her, his hand strong against her upper arm. He removed it quickly once she was balanced, but the brief touch lingered in her mind. "Thank you," she said again, unsure what else to say. "You say that a lot." I suppose I do. No need to thank folks for common decency." Violet fell silent again, uncertain if she'd somehow offended him. The landscape rolled by, the sun beating down mercilessly. She was grateful for her bonnet but could feel perspiration gathering at the nape of her neck. "You don't talk much," Preston observed after another mile. "I've been told I'm too quiet, too timid," she admitted. "Who told you that?" "Everyone. My father said I needed to speak up if I ever hoped to find a husband. My mother's friends called me the ghost because I could sit through an entire tea without anyone remembering I was there." Preston considered this for a moment. "Nothing wrong with being careful with your words. Most folks out here talk too much and say too little." The unexpected defense took Violet by surprise. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, noticing the small lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his current expression indicated. "The world's loud enough," Preston continued. "Sometimes a person needs quiet to think straight." He glanced at her. "Your timidity, it's restful, like shade on a hot day." Violet felt something unfurl inside her chest, a tiny bloom of warmth. No one had ever suggested her quietness was anything but a flaw. "My father was a banker," she said, finding her voice. "He wanted me to marry his business partner, but I couldn't. The man was 30 years my senior and had buried 2 wives already." Preston's jaw tightened. "Smart of you to refuse." "I didn't refuse, I just avoided giving an answer until father fell ill. After he and mother passed, I found myself without prospects or protection. Uncle Thomas's invitation was providential." "Territory's no easy place for a woman alone," Preston said, "but there's opportunity here for those willing to work hard." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Violet said with unexpected firmness. "I managed my father's household for years. I can cook, so keep accounts." A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. "Good skills to have. Your uncle's been batching it since your aunt passed 3 years ago. Place could use a woman's touch." The wagon crested a small rise and Preston pointed to a grove of cottonwoods in the distance. "That's Hayes Creek. Your uncle's place is just beyond." Violet felt a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She had never met her Uncle Thomas. He was her mother's brother who had gone west before Violet was born. All she knew of him came from the occasional letter, usually read aloud by her mother at Christmas. As they approached the creek, a shot rang out, echoing across the landscape. The horses startled, and Preston immediately pulled them to a halt, his body tensing. "Get down," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Violet froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Now," Preston said more forcefully, already reaching for her. He practically lifted her from the seat and deposited her on the ground. "Stay behind the wagon." He reached beneath the seat and pulled out a rifle, then moved to the front of the wagon, using one of the horses for cover as he scanned the surroundings. Violet's heart hammered in her chest as she crouched behind the wagon wheel, the dust clinging to her skirt. This was nothing like Boston, nothing like the civilized world she'd known. "Thomas Hayes," Preston called out. "It's Preston Vance, I've got your niece with me." Silence stretched for several seconds before a voice answered from the direction of the creek. "Vance, that really you? Unless you know another fool willing to transport Boston ladies across your God-forsaken property." A figure emerged from the trees, an older man with a gray beard and a shotgun cradled in his arms. He was thin but wiry, wearing a weather-beaten hat and clothes that had seen better days. "Didn't know you were coming today," the man said as he approached. "Thought you might be one of Parker's boys." "Parker causing trouble again?" Preston lowered his rifle but didn't put it away. "Found one of my calves shot yesterday, left to rot." Thomas Hayes spat on the ground. "Waste of good meat." Preston's expression darkened. "Warned him last time there'd be consequences. One problem at a time." Hayes looked toward the wagon. "Where's my niece?" Violet slowly stood, brushing dust from her skirt, trying to calm her racing heart. "I'm here, Uncle Thomas." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then turned to Preston. "She doesn't look much like her mother." "Considering I never met her mother, I couldn't say," Preston replied dryly. Hayes approached Violet, his weathered face unreadable. Up close, she could see her mother in the shape of his eyes and the set of his jaw. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I'm 22, Uncle Thomas." He grunted. "Can you cook?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Been living on beans and biscuits too long." He turned and gestured toward a path. "House is this way. Vance, you staying for supper?" Preston glanced at Violet, then back at Hayes. "Best get these supplies back to Circle R. Boss is expecting them." "Suit yourself." Hayes started walking. "Bring her things, would you?" Preston retrieved Violet's valise from the wagon and handed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly. "Your uncle's bark is worse than his bite," he said quietly. "But if you need anything, Circle R is just over that ridge to the west." "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Vance," Violet said, meeting his eyes. "Preston," he corrected. "Nobody calls me Mr. Vance except the preacher's wife." Violet smiled slightly. "Thank you, Preston." For a moment, something passed between them, a current of understanding, perhaps, or simply recognition of two quiet souls in a loud world. "I'll be by in a few days," Preston said. "Check on that fence line your uncle's been meaning to fix." With that, he tipped his hat, climbed back into the wagon, and turned the horses. Violet watched him go, feeling strangely bereft, before hurrying to catch up with her uncle. Thomas Hayes's cabin was small but solid, with a porch across the front and a corral for horses to one side. A vegetable garden, looking somewhat neglected, stretched behind the house, and chickens scratched in a pen nearby. "It's not much," Hayes said gruffly, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Violet replied, meaning it. There was a peacefulness to the place, nestled as it was among the trees with the mountains in the distance. The interior was sparsely furnished: a table and chairs, a cupboard, a wood stove, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. A door led to what Violet assumed was a bedroom. "You'll sleep in there," Hayes said, pointing to the bedroom. "I'll take the loft." He gestured to a ladder leading to a space above. "I couldn't take your bedroom. You can and you will," he cut her off. "Annie, your aunt, would have my hide if I made her niece sleep in the loft." Violet fell silent, recognizing the tone from her father, the one that brooked no argument. "Get yourself settled," Hayes said more gently. "Supper in an hour." Left alone, Violet entered the small bedroom. A hand-stitched quilt covered the bed, and curtains made from flour sacks framed the window. A dresser with a mirror stood against one wall, and a small trunk at the foot of the bed completed the furnishings. Violet set her valise on the bed and opened it, unpacking her few belongings. As she placed her mother's silver-backed hairbrush on the dresser, she caught her reflection in the mirror: pale face, brown eyes, too large, brown hair coming loose from its pins. She looked lost, and she felt it too. "What am I doing here?" she whispered to herself, but she knew the answer. She was starting over, creating a new life from the ashes of the old. And perhaps in this wild place so different from everything she'd known, she might find a version of herself that wasn't defined by what she lacked: volume, confidence, boldness, but by what she possessed: resilience, kindness, and a quiet strength that had brought her 3,000 miles from home. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Violet rose early, prepared breakfast for her uncle, tended the chickens, worked in the garden, and kept the house. Thomas Hayes was a man of few words, but he seemed to appreciate her cooking, and the small touches she brought to the cabin: fresh flowers on the table, curtains washed and starched, floors swept clean. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch, Thomas smoking his pipe while Violet mended clothes or simply watched the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. It was on one such evening, a week after her arrival, that Preston Vance rode up on a chestnut gelding. Thomas was checking fence lines in the north pasture, leaving Violet alone at the cabin. She saw Preston approaching from a distance and felt a flutter of something in her stomach: nervousness, perhaps, or anticipation. She had thought of him often since their journey from town, remembering the unexpected kindness in his eyes and his words about her timidity being restful. Preston dismounted in front of the porch, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her, his voice, as she remembered, deep and measured. "Mr. Vance," she returned, then corrected herself. "Preston, your uncle around? He's checking fences, should be back before dark." Preston nodded, looking somewhat uncertain, a contrast to the confidence he had displayed during their first meeting. "Would you like some coffee?" Violet offered. "It's fresh made." "That would be welcome, thank you." Violet went inside and returned with 2 cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to Preston, who had taken a seat on the porch steps. "How are you settling in?" he asked as she sat in the rocking chair. "Well enough. Uncle Thomas is not what I expected." "How so?" Violet considered her words carefully. "He's gruffer than my mother described, but kinder than his manner suggests. He leaves wildflowers on my aunt's grave every Sunday." Preston's expression softened. Thomas and Annie were devoted to each other. Her passing hit him hard. They sipped their coffee in companionable silence for a moment. "Your uncle mentioned you've been helping with the accounts," Preston said. "Yes, he had quite a tangle of figures. I've been sorting them out." "You're good with numbers." "I managed my father's household accounts for years," Violet explained. "It's just a matter of organization." Preston seemed to be contemplating something. "Circle R could use someone with that skill. Old man Rafferty, the owner, his eyesight's failing, been making mistakes in the ledgers." "Oh." Violet's interest was piqued. "I could help, perhaps, if Mr. Rafferty wouldn't mind a woman handling his accounts. He cares more about accuracy than propriety these days." Preston set his empty cup aside. "I could bring some ledgers by if you're willing." "I'd like that." Their eyes met, and Violet felt that same current between them, a connection that required no words. The sound of hoofbeats announced Thomas's return. He rode up to the cabin, nodded to Preston, and dismounted. "Vance, didn't expect you today." "Was passing by," Preston said, standing. "Thought I'd check if you needed anything." Thomas eyed him skeptically. "Since when do you pass by 5 miles from Circle Articus' main house?" Preston's neck reddened slightly. "Found a stray heifer, thought it might be one of yours." "Uh-huh." Thomas's tone suggested he didn't believe a word but was choosing not to press. "You staying for supper? Violet makes a fine stew." Preston glanced at Violet, who felt her own cheeks warm. "I'd be obliged," he said. That evening marked a shift. Preston began stopping by the Hayes Ranch with increasing frequency, sometimes with legitimate ranch business, other times with transparent excuses that Thomas pretended to accept with gruff indifference. Violet found herself looking forward to these visits, planning her days around the possibility of seeing Preston. They would often sit on the porch together, talking softly while Thomas dozed in his chair or worked in the barn. Preston brought ledgers from Circle R, and Violet spent evenings organizing the ranch accounts, finding satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. Sometimes, Preston would watch her work, asking questions about her system, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers as he leaned in to see the figures. It was during one such evening, with autumn painting the landscape in russet and gold, that their relationship deepened. They were alone in the cabin, Thomas having ridden into town for supplies. Violet was explaining a discrepancy she'd found in the cattle tallies when she looked up to find Preston watching her with intensity. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You're different when you talk about numbers," he said. Your voice gets stronger, your eyes light up. Violet set down her pencil. I've always found comfort in figures. They either add up or they don't. There's no ambiguity. Unlike people, Preston suggested. Exactly. Violet smiled slightly. People are much harder to calculate. Preston reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. Some people are easier to read than others. Violet's heart quickened. And how do you rate me, Preston Vance? As someone who sees more than she says, who feels deeply but guards her heart. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. Someone worth knowing. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious. Violet felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't name. The sound of a wagon approaching broke the spell. Preston released her hand and stood just as Thomas's voice called from outside. Give me a hand with these supplies, Vance, since you're making yourself at home in my cabin. Preston's lips quirked in a half-smile. Your uncle has timing, I'll give him that. As autumn deepened toward winter, Preston's visits became a fixture in Violet's life. He would ride over several times a week, sometimes staying for supper, other times just long enough to check on something for Thomas or bring more ledger work for Violet. Thomas watched this developing relationship with a mixture of gruffness and quiet approval. One evening, after Preston had ridden back to Circle R, he sat across from Violet at the table and cleared his throat. Vance is a good man, he said, his eyes on the coffee cup in his weathered hands. Not one for fancy words, but his actions speak true. Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks. We're friends, Uncle Thomas, he snorted softly. Man doesn't ride 5 miles in the opposite direction of home just for friendship, girl. She couldn't argue with that logic. I enjoy his company, she admitted. Good. Thomas nodded once decisively. Your mother would have approved. She always said you needed someone steady. The mention of her mother brought a pang of grief, still fresh despite the months that had passed. I miss her, Violet said softly. Both of them? Thomas reached across the table and awkwardly patted her hand, the first truly affectionate gesture he'd shown her. They'd be proud of you, coming all this way, making a new life. Violet blinked back tears. Thank you for taking me in. Family's family, Thomas said simply. Besides, place needed a woman's touch. He stood, signaling the end of the emotional conversation. Getting cold tonight, best check the woodpile. As he went outside, Violet smiled to herself. Her uncle's gruff exterior concealed a kind heart, much like another man she was coming to care for deeply. Winter arrived with a vengeance in early December. Snow blanketed the landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into something magical but treacherous. Travel became difficult, but Preston still made his way to the Hayes Ranch whenever weather permitted. It was during one such visit, with a fire crackling in the hearth and Thomas having retired early, that Preston finally spoke of his feelings. I've been thinking, he began, his voice low. Violet looked up from her mending. A dangerous pastime, she teased gently, the corner of his mouth lifted. So I've been told. He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the small sofa. Violet, I'm not a man of many words, I've noticed, she interrupted, smiling. He chuckled, then grew serious again. When I first met you, standing in Miller's store looking like a startled fawn, I thought you were just another Eastern girl who wouldn't last a month out here. Not the most romantic beginning, Violet noted, her heart beginning to race. No, but I was wrong. Preston took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Your quietness isn't weakness, it's strength. You watch, you listen, you think before you speak. In a place where most men shoot first and ask questions later, that's rare. Violet felt warmth spread through her chest. Most people have always seen my timidity as a flaw. Your timidity shelters me, Preston said, his voice deepening with emotion. It gives me a place to be still in a world that's always demanding action. When I'm with you, I don't have to be the Circle R foreman or the man who solves everyone's problems. I can just be Preston. Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. No one has ever valued that part of me before. I do, Preston said simply. I value all of you, Violet Hayes. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Violet found herself meeting him halfway, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met in a gentle kiss. It was brief but perfect, a promise, a beginning. When they parted, Preston's eyes were filled with something Violet recognized as love, though neither had spoken the word yet. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Storm's coming in." Violet nodded, though everything in her wanted him to stay. "Be careful riding back." Preston stood, gathering his coat and hat. At the door, he turned back to her. "I'll return as soon as the weather clears." But the storm that blew in that night was the worst in recent memory, dropping 3 feet of snow and plunging temperatures to dangerous lows. For 5 days, the Hayes Ranch was isolated, with Thomas and Violet venturing no further than the barn to tend to the livestock. Violet worried constantly about Preston, imagining him attempting to reach them and becoming lost in the blinding snow. Thomas assured her that Vance was too experienced to take such risks, but she saw the concern in her uncle's eyes as well. On the 6th day, as Violet was kneading bread dough, she heard Thomas shout from outside. She rushed to the door to see 3 riders approaching through the snow, Preston at the lead, followed by 2 men she didn't recognize. Relief flooded through her. She grabbed her shawl and hurried onto the porch, heedless of the cold. Preston dismounted quickly, his face grim despite the obvious joy at seeing her. "Trouble," he said simply as Thomas joined them. "Parker and his men raided Circle R last night, burned the bunkhouse. Old man Rafferty's hurt bad." Thomas's expression hardened. "How many men?" "At least 8, maybe more. They took 20 head of cattle and made threats to come back." Preston looked at Violet, his eyes softening briefly before returning to Thomas. "They mentioned your place too, Hayes, said something about finishing what they started." Thomas spat into the snow. "Been waiting for this. Parker's wanted my water rights for years." "What does that mean?" Violet asked, looking between the 2 men. "It means," Preston said gently, "that you need to get ready to ride to town. It's not safe here." Violet felt fear grip her heart, but alongside it was a surprising resolve. "No," both men looked at her in surprise. "I'm not leaving," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my home now, too." "Violet," Preston began, his tone brooking no argument, "these men are dangerous." "They've already hurt Rafferty and they won't hesitate. I understand the danger," she interrupted. "But I won't be sent away like a child while you and Uncle Thomas face it alone." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She's got Hayes' blood in her after all," he said to Preston. "Stubborn as her mother." Preston looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead he introduced the 2 men with him, ranch hands from Circle R named Cooper and Mendez. They had come to help prepare for Parker's potential attack. The next hours were a flurry of activity. The men fortified the house and barn, moving livestock to the corral nearest the cabin where they could be defended. Ammunition was counted and distributed, and positions were assigned. Violet worked alongside them, preparing food, filling canteens, and loading spare rifles. As dusk approached, Preston found her alone in the kitchen. "You should still go to town," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Thomas has a buckboard. Cooper could take you." Violet set down the coffee pot she was filling. "My place is here." "Violet, no." She turned to face him fully. "All my life, people have made decisions for me, Preston. They've told me I was too timid, too quiet, too small for this world. I let them define me." She stepped closer to him. "But here, with you and Uncle Thomas, I've found my voice, my strength. I won't abandon that now." Preston's expression shifted from frustration to something like pride. "You're the most surprising woman I've ever met, Violet Hayes." "Good," she said, smiling slightly. "I'd hate to be predictable." He laughed softly, then grew serious again. "If things go badly, they won't," she insisted. "If they do," he continued, "promise me you'll hide. The root cellar under the pantry, Thomas showed it to me. Promise me." Violet saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "I promise," she said softly. Preston pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly. "When this is over," he murmured against her hair, "we have things to discuss, important things." Violet's heart skipped. "Yes, we do." A shout from outside separated them. Thomas burst through the door, rifle in hand. "Riders coming, at least 6. Preston's expression hardened as he released Violet. "Sooner than expected." He looked at her one last time. "Remember your promise." As the men took their positions, Violet stood in the doorway, a loaded shotgun in her hands. Despite her outward resolve, fear coiled in her stomach. This wasn't Boston, with its polite society and predictable dangers. This was the territory where disputes were often settled with bullets. 6 riders approached in the fading light, stopping just beyond rifle range. A tall man with a gray-streaked beard separated from the group and rode forward alone. "That's Parker," Thomas muttered from his position by the window. "Hayes," Parker called out, "I know you're in there." "Come out and talk like civilized men," Thomas snorted. "Civilized men don't burn bunkhouses." "Should I answer him?" Violet asked. Both Thomas and Preston looked at her in surprise. "Might buy us time," she explained. "They won't expect a woman." Preston and Thomas exchanged glances, then Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Stay in the doorway, don't go outside." Violet stepped fully into the doorframe, keeping the shotgun visible but lowered. "Mr. Parker," she called, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "My uncle is indisposed at present. Perhaps you could state your business with me." There was a moment of confused silence before Parker replied. "And who might you be, miss?" "Violet Hayes." "Thomas Hayes is my uncle." Parker rode a few steps closer. "Didn't know old Thomas had family." "Well, Miss Hayes, my business is simple. Your uncle's sitting on the best water source in the county. I've offered to buy his land fair and square, but he refuses. Now I'm done asking politely." "I see," Violet replied, her mind racing. "And burning the Circle R bunkhouse was that your idea of a polite request as well?" Parker's expression darkened. "That was a message, one your uncle would be wise to heed." Violet felt a strange calm settle over her, the same feeling she used to get when negotiating with difficult vendors for her father's household. "Mr. Parker, I've recently reviewed my uncle's accounts and property deeds. Did you know that he's registered his water rights with the territorial governor? Any attempt to seize this property would be met with the full force of territorial law." This was a bluff. Violet had no idea if Thomas had registered anything with the governor, but it sounded official enough to potentially give Parker pause. Parker's hesitation was visible even from a distance. "Hayes never mentioned no registration. My uncle prefers action to words, Mr. Parker. Now I suggest you and your men leave peacefully. Sheriff Collins is expected for supper and he's bringing deputies." Another bluff, but delivered with such calm assurance that Parker visibly shifted in his saddle. "You're lying," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Violet replied coolly. "Would you care to wait and find out?" A tense silence followed. Parker turned to look at his men, who were growing restless. The standoff could go either way. Then the sound of hoofbeats approached from the east, multiple riders moving fast. Parker's head snapped toward the sound. "Seems the sheriff is early," Violet remarked, though her heart was pounding. She had no idea who was approaching. Parker hesitated only a moment longer before wheeling his horse around. "This ain't over, Hayes," he called out, then signaled to his men. They rode off quickly, disappearing into the gathering dusk. As they departed, the new riders came into view, 5 men wearing Circle R brands on their saddles. Led by a silver-haired man Violet recognized from Preston's description as Jeremiah Rafferty, owner of Circle R. Preston rushed outside, rifle still in hand, as the riders approached. "Mr. Rafferty, you shouldn't be riding in your condition." The old rancher dismounted stiffly, one arm bandaged. "Couldn't let you boys have all the fun," he said, then looked toward the doorway where Violet stood. "This the girl you've been mooning over, Vance?" Preston's ears reddened. "Mr. Rafferty, may I present Miss Violet Hayes, Thomas Hayes's niece. Violet, this is Jeremiah Rafferty." Rafferty approached and tipped his hat. "Miss Hayes, heard you've been putting my books in order, appreciate that." His sharp eyes assessed her. Also heard you just faced down Parker and his boys with nothing but words and a shotgun you probably don't know how to fire. Violet managed a small smile. The second part is true, sir. Rafferty laughed, a booming sound that seemed to release the tension in the air. Preston, you better marry this girl before someone else does. The following days brought significant changes. Parker and his men were arrested when they tried to sell Circle R cattle in the next county. The territorial marshal, alerted by Rafferty's telegrams, arrived with enough men to ensure the safety of both ranches. Thomas, impressed by his niece's courage, formally registered the Hayes water rights with the territorial government, making Violet's bluff retroactively true. He also named her co-owner of the ranch, a gesture that left her speechless with gratitude. But the most significant change came on a crisp winter evening with snow glistening in the moonlight. Preston arrived at the Hayes ranch carrying a small package. He found Violet alone on the porch, wrapped in a shawl and watching the stars. Cold to be sitting outside, he remarked as he climbed the steps. Worth it for the view, she replied, smiling as he sat beside her. Uncle Thomas is visiting Mr. Rafferty. They've become quite the friends since the standoff. Preston nodded, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Good, I was hoping to speak with you alone. Violet's heart quickened. Oh, I'm not good with words, he began, as you well know. You do just fine, she assured him. Preston took a deep breath. When I first came west, I thought I was looking for open spaces, room to breathe. What I didn't realize was that I was also looking for a kind of peace I'd never found. He turned to face her fully. I found it with you, Violet, in your quiet strength. Your thoughtful ways. He withdrew the small package from his pocket and unwrapped it, revealing a simple gold band. This was my mother's. She told me to give it to a woman who made me better than I am. Violet's breath caught in her throat as Preston took her hand. I love you, Violet Hayes. Your so-called timidity shelters me in ways I never knew I needed. Will you marry me? Tears spilled onto Violet's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder with confidence. Yes, I will marry you, Preston Vance. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her into his arms, Violet felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She had traveled thousands of miles from everything familiar, only to find her true home in the arms of a man who valued her exactly as she was. 6 months later, they were married in the small church in Cottonwood Springs. Violet wore a simple white dress she had made herself with wild roses in her hair. Preston, unrecognizable in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Thomas Hayes walked his niece down the aisle, his weathered face softened with pride. After the ceremony, as guests gathered at the Hayes ranch for the celebration, Preston found a moment alone with his bride beneath the cottonwood trees. Happy? He asked, his fingers intertwining with hers. Violet smiled, no longer the timid Boston girl who had arrived a year before. Completely. Your uncle says we can build on the southeast corner of his property, close enough to help with both ranches, far enough for privacy. Sounds perfect, Violet said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Mr. Rafferty's offered to make me partner at Circle R, Preston continued. Says he needs someone with a good head for business now that you've shown him how disorganized his accounts were. Violet laughed softly. And what did you say? I said yes on one condition. Preston's eyes twinkled. That my wife be hired as the official bookkeeper. Seems she has quite a head for figures. Your wife accepts the position, Violet replied, stretching up to kiss him. As Preston's arms encircled her, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a quiet, overlooked girl in Boston to a woman who had found her voice, her courage, and her heart in the wild territory. She had been called too timid all her life, but in this place with this man, her timidity had become her strength. What are you thinking? Preston murmured against her hair. That sometimes you have to travel a very long way to find where you truly belong, she answered. And that the qualities others see as weaknesses can be exactly what someone else needs. Preston smiled, pulling back to look into her eyes. Wise words, Mrs. Vance. I have my moments, Violet replied, her voice soft but sure, no longer afraid to be heard.